Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today is a special episode, definitely one of the more thinking cap oriented episodes, and that's saying something from my channel. This is entitled The Philosophical Foundations of Rational Thought. So while we wait for people to show up, I'll give a sort of brief rundown of how I sort of got into philosophy. In high school, I was introduced to philosophy by my dad. I read a book by R.C. Sproul, The Consequence of Ideas. And then from there, I got first a minor and then a major in college in philosophy. And one of the most formative events was when I read Descartes' Meditations in Introduction to Philosophy, where Descartes begins from first principles to outline how one engages in philosophy, how one thinks. And that's traditionally called foundationalism. I also was introduced to Kant, and he was also made a very large impact on me as well. And so over the years, I've been trying to piece together several principles to begin to construct a philosophical model. Basically, philosophy from the pre-Socratics up until the empiricists like Hume were trying to build something rather than deconstruct and analyze. So Hume or empiricism and in many regards postmodernism and Nietzsche are all, in some sense, anti-philosophers, in my estimation, because they're not building something. And so, also, too, the world is a complex, difficult to understand. How is it and that things are the way they are? I've already talked about simulation. So it's like, well, how do you tell the real thing from the simulation? And there's a lot to get into. But this is what I've come to the conclusions of after 20 years of work in philosophy. What are the foundations for rational thought? So all we're going to limit ourselves to today are how do we get this ball rolling? How do we start? So here we go. Archimedes once said, if you give him a fixed piece of ground and enough levers, he can move the earth. I argue that in philosophy, you can do something like that. What is the foundation of philosophy? Descartes in his meditation goes through a series of exercises whereby he arrives at several indubitable truths, including but not limited to the existence of his own mind and God. With indubitable truths, we have the fixed ground in philosophy. Using the three axioms of philosophy, the law of identity, the law of the excluded middle, and the law of non-contradiction, we have our levers. With the fixed ground of indubitable truths and the levers of the three laws of logic, we shall move the universe. The foundation of the basis of rational thought in philosophy is based on two kinds of truths, and their relations to each other. We have indubitable truths, truths that cannot be doubted, for example, the cogito ergo sum, and transcendental truths, which are truths that follow necessarily as conditions for other truths. See the transcendental argument for a priori synthetic reasoning. I will get to that later in this discussion. And the interplay between them using deductive reasoning, which is the reasoning relating of mental objects to one another and to reach some conclusion. The relations of these two kinds of truths using deductive reasoning is the foundation of rational thought. Descartes speaks of these indubitable truths as clear and distinct ideas. A clear and distinct idea itself is rooted in the idea of innate ideas. Innate ideas go back at least as far back as Plato and is the claim that prior to experience we were born with certain ideas. A clear and distinct idea is an idea that is free from all possible doubt and is seen intuitively as true as the mind comprehends the idea. A good example of a clear and distinct idea is a triangle. The triangle is defined as an enclosed geometric object whereby the sum interior angles add up to 180 degrees. As soon as you comprehend what enclosed angles and degrees mean, it becomes clear. Descartes begins his meditations by saying that he is certain of the existence of his own mind. For while he might doubt the existence of his body, the trustworthiness of his senses, and even that he admits might be deceived by a demon, what he cannot doubt is his own mind or intellect. In order to doubt one's own existence, one is compelled to think about it. This is a self-performative contradiction. A self-performative contradiction is a contradiction in which you are doing the very thing you say cannot be done, or fail to provide an account of how it could be done. One could, in theory, doubt one's body, but not one's mind. Think of Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, where a man wakes up in a beetle body. His mind is the same in the before and the after transformation, but not his body. The man, as he was before he went to sleep, lost his human body and gained a beetle body. If, for instance, if he had another mind in the same body, he would not be the same man, but someone else. This thought experiment shows us that the mind cannot be doubted and the body can be. One might also add as well the idea that I think it's like every 7 years, all the cells in your body are replaced. Okay, well, then every 7 years, on a purely material level, you're a totally new person. Like what exactly is the continuous you over time? Well, that would be your mind, because that's the thing that hinges all of this together. Descartes' ontological argument for God goes like this, a quote from the Sixth Meditation. And the whole force of the argument of which I have here availed myself to establish the existence of God consists in this, that I perceive I could not possibly be of such a nature as I am, and yet have in my mind the idea of God. If God did not really exist, this same God, I say, whose idea is in my mind, that is, a being who possesses all these lofty perfections, of which the mind may have some slight conception, without, however, being able to fully comprehend them, and who is wholly superior to all defect and has nothing that marks imperfection. Whence it is sufficiently manifest that he cannot be a deceiver, since it is a dictate of the natural light that all fraud and deception spring from some defect. Descartes moves from the idea of God to the necessity of his existence. This is done through an appeal to his omniproperties. Since man is finite and yet contains the idea of this being within his mind, then he cannot have been the author of the idea, since these infinite qualities clearly have meanings but are beyond his ken to understand in only but the barest terms. This reasoning is sound and would be used in a court case. Imagine if a child were to be charged with planning a heist, and all that he knew about heists were what he saw in film, and when asked about the details for robbing a bank, could give no definite answer. Clearly, the child, not being able to conceive of the thing to be done, could not have been the author of the plan. In like manner, we are the child, and the idea of God is the plan for the heist. The only plausible explanation for the idea of God that we have is that he put it there. This ontological argument hinges on epistemic limits of man's knowledge. I'll also add, most ontological arguments that get tossed around are either Anselmian or the more modern one with Alvin Plantinga. But the thing is, though, it's funny that Descartes really doesn't get a lot of traction, even though I think his ontological argument is the best one, because this leads to what I call the empiricist dilemma. A further exposition on this idea is the empiricist dilemma. If you take the proposition that all objects of the mind first originated in the senses, and furthermore assert that there is no sense data from which to create the idea of God, where did the idea come from? The empiricist has no explanation, since there is no sense data to provide the mind with the concept of God. This dilemma illustrates Descartes' genius. So the empiricist has to either say there is no rational foundation. The empiricist either has to say that there are sense data in the universe that can be derived, you can derive God from, which then would fold a lot of strong atheist materialists, which they wouldn't do that. Or just say that there is no cause. And then you have this uncaused mental thought, which is just extremely unsatisfactory from a philosophical point of view. All right, now, I'm not claiming that these are the only two indubitable truths, the mind and God, but for the sake of today's discussion, we'll just limit ourselves to these. We have two indubitable truths to work with here, the mind and God. What can we prove with just these two clear and distinct ideas? Let us begin with the mind. Using Leibniz's formula of the law of identity, any two things can be claimed to be identical if and only if they share all properties P at some time T. A raging problem in modern philosophy is the mind-brain identity problem. Materialism and physicalism demands that the mind and the brain are identical. Every mental state is reducible to a brain state. If we hold in our mind two kinds of objects, mental states and brain states, in order to demonstrate an identity, one must show that they are both share all the same properties P at the same time T. This, of course, cannot be done. If we use three inferences, which I call the three I's, indubitability, that which cannot be doubted, invisibility, that which cannot be divided, and incorrigibility, that which cannot be observed, we can demonstrate that mental states in the mind are indeed not identical to brain states or the brain. The mind is indubitable and the brain is not. As we saw with the cogito, one cannot doubt one's own mind without engaging in a self-performative contradiction. The body, or in this case the brain, can be doubted, but not the mind, or else you would not exist. Think Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, where a man wakes up in a beetle body. That what can be doubted is not identical to that which can be doubted. Since the brain cannot be doubted and the mind cannot be doubted, there is an identity. Then an identity relation is not established. The mind is indivisible and the brain is not. One can cut the brain of a dead man into pieces and divide it. The mind is unitary and cannot be divided. For example, if I have the mental state of your memory, if I ask you of the mental state of your memory of yesterday's lunch, and I were to ask for half of that memory, you might think my question queer. Such a thing is nonsense. That which can be cut is not identical to that which cannot be cut. The brain has access to physical sense perception, the mind does not. To ask of the weight, mass, extension, division, or color of a thought is a meaningless question. It is not meaningless with regards to the brain. All the properties ascribed to the brain are properties of a physical object. To not have these properties is by definition to not be physical. This shows us that mental states and brain states lack identity. Incorrigibility needs some defining. In philosophy, this means one's own intrasubjective experiences and that you cannot be wrong about them. For example, the feeling of pain at being stabbed is incorrigible. How could anyone tell me that I'm not in pain if I have in fact been stabbed? I cannot be wrong about the fact that I am in pain. I might be wrong as to the reason why I am in pain, but not that I am in pain. We can also speak of public versus private. Brain states are public in that competently trained professionals using CAT scan can read your brain states. Your mental states are not accessible in the same way. For example, like the feeling of pain, one could include the feeling of sadness, joy, and fatigue. These feelings are incorrigible and inaccessible to any outsider unless you tell them. This shows us that the brain, potentially observable to an outsider, while the mental states are not. Therefore, an identity relation has not been established. Using Leibniz's law of identity, the three I's of indubitability, indivisibility, and incorrigibility, a man may demonstrate that the mind and the brain are not identical. This, of course, totally refutes materialism and also disproves idealism, the concept that all is mind. If there are, in fact, two substances, then any form of substance monism is false. A brief digression must needs be made into epistemology. With the two indubitable truths of the mind and God, we have opened up a concept of epistemology called a priori synthetic. In the world of epistemology, there are four terms we must become familiar with: a priori, a posteriori, analytic, and synthetic. A priori means before experience, a posteriori means after experience, analytic means the predicate is contained in the subject, and synthetic means that something is added to the subject that was not contained in it, definitionally. Examples: a priori analytic, a bachelor is an unmarried male. Here the predicate unmarried male is contained in the subject bachelor. A priori synthetic, the parallel line postulate. If you have a point above a line, you can only draw one line through that point such that this new line is parallel with the first. Something new is added to the subject, but it is intuitively true without the need for an experiment. A priori synthetic. A posteriori synthetic, the scientific observation that when the water is heated, it boils. So why is a priori synthetic so important? It's important because it tells us things that are true about the real world before we experience the real world. That's why it's so important. Now, I mean, if we look at the total list of facts or truths that are a priori synthetic versus a posteriori synthetic is far and away a larger category. But the fact that we do have this core of truths that we know about the world before experience is crucial for understanding and engaging with the world. Empiricists might wish to deny the concept of an a priori synthetic truth. We might call these strong empiricists, but if they do, they engage in a self-performative contradiction. Let us imagine this statement from a strong empiricist. The idea of a category of knowledge called a priori synthetic is false. How could this be true? Is it true analytically? No, predicate is not contained in the subject. As the definition of a priori synthetic does not mean false, as in the case of bachelor, which does mean unmarried male. Could it be disproved by observation? That is difficult to envision. What kind of observation would one have to observe to disprove this claim? This statement could only make sense as a subset of knowledge that is a priori synthetic itself, the very thing it seeks to deny. This puts the strong empiricist in a self-performative contradiction. This is an example of a transcendental argument. A transcendental argument seeks to show that for X to be true, some precondition Y must also be true. For the aforementioned argument to be true, it must rely on the category of thought known as a priori synthetic, which results in a self-performative contradiction. This shows us that some ideas are true based on the force of their own content. The transcendental proof for the a priori grounding of empiricism. If we look at a posteriori / inductive / scientific reasoning, we must ask, what are the preconditions for objects in the mind derived from sense to exist? So what I mean by this is, when you are doing the scientific empirical process, you are relating objects in the mind to each other in a part of this ordered, structured, investigative mode of acquiring knowledge. What must be the case for that to be possible, right? To be possible. At least 4 things spring to mind: the existence of God, minds, space, and some means of correlating mental objects. Descartes in his meditation argues that he might be deceived by an evil demon which casts doubt on his ability to trust sensory data. He escapes this dilemma with his ontological argument for God. Having shown that this benevolent being exists, one can be assured that in most cases, one's senses are not lying to you, since, of course, one of God's omniproperties is omnibenevolence. This is the first precondition for empiricism. Can you trust your senses? And God in his goodness confirms your sensory perception. Objects of sense must exist in space. Since as objects with extension, they must exist in space that allows for extension. If there is no space, then no objects with extension can exist. Reasoning cannot happen without minds. The mind is an indubitable truth. Rocks and animals do not reason. Therefore, the objective reality of the mental is a precondition for reasoning about sensory experience. So we have to start with the mind. First of all, without a mind, you don't even have this entire discourse or process going at all. It's a sort of hard limit that you just have to accept when you engage in this kind of discourse. And furthermore, non-living organisms and, or things like rocks or water, or living organisms like animals don't do this either. So the mind is where you have to start. And we must have some sort of preloaded structure to even correlate mental objects to each other in some form of reasoning. Using Kant's concept of the unity of apperception, the idea that there is a conscious self with the means to correlate ideas is a precondition for organizing and relating mental objects that are derived from sense data. So if we use Hume's idea that we're just a bundle of impressions, what is the means by which those impressions are A, bundled, and then 2, relate to each other? Kant, and I agree with Kant that Hume does not provide an account of that. And Kant provides the account of the unity of apperception. Using these 4 concepts as preconditions for a posteriori reasoning, I have demonstrated the transcendental proof for the a priori grounding of empiricism. If this is rejected, the empiricist must either assent that he has no rational foundation for the reasoning process of empiricism, or he must justify empiricism with relation to empiricism, which is the fallacy of a circular argument. Most empiricists go in either of the 2 directions. This shows us how unserious this school of thought is. So again, the point of this is not that all knowledge that man can have is a priori. No, it's not. But there has to be this a priori grounding that allows for the very process of empirical investigation. Now we're going to derive some conclusions from the existence of God. The problem of existence. I argue that something exists for one of 2 reasons. The cause for its existence is external to itself, or the causes of its existence is internal to itself. If we look at nature and all that can be observed, everything falls into the first category. The problem is philosophical. We have an infinite regress of the causes that can never get started. Yet something does exist, and the Gordian knot of causation must be cut. The solution is a being in whom the explanation for his existence is himself. This is the concept of aseity. God and the universe cannot be identical as the cause of the universe. As the cause of the universe is something external to itself. For example, if all the parts of a thing are contingent, then the whole is contingent. For example, all the atoms that make up a human are contingent. Therefore, the human is contingent. This holds the same for the universe. since all the component parts refer to some other thing for their cause. With this, we rule out pantheism, panentheism, animism, as well as polytheism, since the universe and lesser gods are not possessing of aseity. This being must also be personal, since the move from timelessness to temporality in the act of creation is a state-event causation, and that can only be affected by a mind. An event causation is, say, a brick being thrown to break a window. The broken window event is caused by the thrown brick event. An example of a state causation is the surface tension of water is such that the wood floats. The state of the wood floating is caused by the state of the water's surface tension. Events are caused by actors and states by principles of necessary relations. Creation then is the state-event causation, whereby we move from an eternal to a temporal mode of existing. If God related to the universe in a state causal way, the universe would be co-eternal with him, which, as we know, it's not, because it's composed of contingent parts. So there was some change in God's relations from no other thing but himself to himself in creation, a change that only a mind can effect. Forces outside any external stimuli did not change in this way. What external stimuli did God have before the universe? This being is a qualitatively different being than all others, including angels, demons, gods, etc., and material things. They all exist for some reason external to themselves, but he exists by the necessity of his own being. And to just double back on the importance of why we need to have a person here, if we have eternity before creation, that would just be the state that we're in. But then to go to another state, temporality, why would that be the case, right? I mean, if you know, I take this from William Lane Craig's introduction to Christian philosophy. I think it was like his, what was it now? I can't remember. It was the fourth printing of one of his, I was On Guard or something. And he said that, you know, if we could imagine a scenario where wood is floating on water eternally. But then why would it stop floating? If these were the state conditions that just were? Well, it wouldn't, because water and wood they don't choose to do anything. So this also eliminates the idea that God is just some sort of abstract force in the ether. Okay, as a recap, we'll go over some of the key ideas, because I know there's a lot here. I'm starting from the relationship between indubitable truths that can be proven transcendentally, and deductive reasoning. An indubitable truth is a truth that cannot be doubted. A transcendental proof seeks to show that for X to be true, some precondition Y must also be true. Did I miss this earlier? No, I didn't. Okay. Transcendental proof seeks to show that for X to be true, some precondition Y must also be true. Deductive reasoning is the line of reasoning that seeks to derive valid inferences from logical premises. If the line of reasoning is correct, the argument is valid. It is sound if the form of the argument is valid and the premise true. The mind and God are indubitable truths. There may be more, though for the sake of today's discussion, I am not attempting to demonstrate anymore or make reference to them as for extrapolation purposes. The cogito ergo sum, the mind cannot be doubted, because even if one believes he is being deceived, the fact that he is cannot be denied, because there's still someone being deceived. Ontological argument for God, according to Descartes. The concept of God is not fully understood by humans, therefore humans cannot have been the cause of the idea of God. God must have been the cause of the idea of God. Leibniz's law. Any two things can be claimed to be identical if and only if they share all properties P at some time T. Indubitability cannot be doubted. Indivisibility cannot be divided. Incorrigibility and intersubjective experience you cannot be wrong about. So if we combine Leibniz's law with the three I's, we demonstrate that the mind and mental states are identical to the brain or brain states, which demonstrates that both forms of monism, whether they be materialism or idealism, are false. Now, we move on to the transcendental proof for a priori synthetic reasoning. To argue against the concept of a priori synthetic truth is to use it. This is, of course, important, since now we have a knowledge set category of truths about the world prior to experience. Strong empiricist denies the existence and utility of a priori synthetic reasoning. Weak empiricist might not deny the use of a priori synthetic reasoning, yet still privileges empirical sense data. Transcendental proof for the a priori grounding of empiricism. For the creation of mental objects derived from sense to exist, we need 4 elements: God, minds, space, and some means of correlating mental objects. These must exist before empiricism can even occur. So there's 2 dilemmas that arise here for the empiricists. The first one is, in order to deny a priori synthetic reasoning, they must, of course, appeal to it, which leads to a self-performative contradiction. And if they want to have some sort of rational justification for the empirical process, they're going to have to either accept a transcendental proof for the a priori grounding of empiricism, or argue that there is no rational justification. It just works. Well, to say it just works is actually circular reasoning, because it appeals to the method to justify the method. So you can't do that either. So this is a real bind for the empiricist. Okay, from the idea of God, we know that we have aseity, the idea that he has existence in himself, right? If we didn't have such a being, then we would have no way to start the causal chain of contingent things, because every appeal to the cause of some contingent thing is some other contingent thing, and there's no way for it to get started. From this, we also can deduce that since the universe is not eternal, because it's composed of contingent parts, which themselves need explanation, and with the example, if each part of a system is contingent, then the entire system is contingent, its cause is something external to itself, which we call God, because God is the one who breaks this chain. So we can then conclude that pantheism, panentheism, animism, and polytheism are false, because all of these things are composed of contingent parts, whereas God is not. So therefore, whatever he is, he can't be like them. And then we know that God must be a person, because he affected a state event change from eternal state to a temporal state. So I call this mere monotheism. And so from these core axioms of deductive reasoning, from indubitable truths and truths that can be transcendentally proven, we have eliminated materialism and idealism from the equation. We've eliminated pantheism, panentheism, animism, and polytheism from the equation. And this is the power that a priori synthetic reasoning can give you. It can give you true knowledge about the external world without having to test it. Now, of course, some things still have to be tested. I'm not saying you don't do that. But this is an exposition on the importance of how a priori synthetic reasoning can give us a very clear view of the world prior to any experience with it. All right, now that was an awfully dense episode. I'm not going to go into all the details here. So yeah, let's just see if there's anything to engage with here in the chat. Not a whole lot here. Record Deepness says it's a lot to think about. Yeah, I know. That's why I'm wrapping up right now. This is a short episode. The mind and the brain are clearly different things. Yes, exactly. All right, everyone. I know this was a lot to take in, though. If you need help understanding terms, you can just consult ChatGPT. It's usually pretty good at explaining all this. This is Ty Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.